Hey.
Okay. Hey,
Hey.
we're live.
We are?
Or, well, we're on
Virtually
tape.
live.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, calling Chris Anderson, where are you?
I'm in Berchtesgaden,
Yeah.
and we are standing in front of what had been the big bay window in
Right. So if you
the
see
little
those
corporal's house.
pictures, and maybe we'll find one to put over this.
Yeah.
This is Hitler's house, is right here,
I
and
had
the
his view.
big window, and you're probably standing right where he was standing.
And he wasn't a viewer of History Happy Hour.
No.
Okay, good.
No. Did you in this spot? Do you have a message for
I
the
do.
Fuhrer?
I do. I do in many ways. Like this way, this way, this way.
Okay. I shared the
Oh,
messages.
you're so.
Yeah, I know.
See, I
I'm
knew you'd do
safer.
that.
Hey, welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Tours, which is why we're here, because got a whole bunch of people. Can you guys give us some applause or something so we know you're here? Whoa. And it's a live, non-studio audience. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. Yeah, we're glad you're here. And I should mention that we want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, especially our top shelf Patreon supporters. And you can become one of them by going to, now I don't know my script in front of me, but I believe it's patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Yeah. And our show today is an encore episode, and it's about the life and times of Billy the Kid. Yes. Yeah. So it has nothing to do with the location.
That's a nice segue.
Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, let's leave that alone. But we're on the second to last day, I guess, of our tour.
Band of Brothers trip.
Yeah, of our Band of Brothers tour. So we're doing all the Berchtesgaden sites today, and then we're going up to the Eagle's Nest, which should be fun, although it may be locked in. We'll see in clouds. Yeah. And then tomorrow, where do we go tomorwer?
Well, we go to Zellemzee in Kaprun, where Easy Company finishes up the war, and then I raffle off the hat because we're not gonna wear the hat at the same time.
It's been a great trip.
It's been a great trip.
So we're glad you're here. Let us know what you're drinking, where you are, what the weather is, and we appreciate that. So Chris, why don't you give us a cue for the open?
All right.
Oh, there we go.
Wow. That was all over the place. Bar's open.
Bar's open. Listen, a couple of years ago, we had on James Mills to talk about his book, Billy the Kid. And it turned into actually our most watched show of all time. Yeah. So naturally, we wanted to have James come back with his new book, which is called In the Days of Billy the Kid, focusing on some of the Hispano characters who are often left out of the story of the Old West. James lives in Australia, but has studied the American frontier and numerous other areas of history since childhood. He has published numerous articles for True West and Wild West magazines, and he enjoys living a quiet life with his dog and his cat. James Mills, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hey, it's good to see you guys again.
Yeah, good to see you. How you been?
Pretty good. Things have changed. I'm engaged now.
Hey!
Oh, fantastic!
Congratulations.
A couple of months ago. I just want to say to her, actually, Meg, my fiance, could be watching this, so give her a little shout. Start.
Okay, so maybe that explains the kind of the Vaseline look on your lens there. You're just trying to look good for your fiance.
I'm on an iPad. That's the problem.
James,
on an iPad. So.
James, we just gave you the softball there. You could have said, "Of course, that's the reason," and then
okay, yeah, that's all right. I got to say, I'm not drinking today because it's where I'm recording it. It's morning. Chris, are you drinking?
I'm having fizzy water because the mini bar at the hotel is a little not well stocked. So,
and I don't know, James, if you are enjoying a cocktail, but in any case,
I don't drink. So.
Oh, there you go. So you
okay? So this is a teetotaling History Happy Hour. So James, your last book was about Billy the Kid, who's one of the best known characters of the Old West, and this book focuses on 4 people I'm going to guess most of our audience has never heard of. So, give us a sense of what led you to write this book.
As soon as I finished Billy the Kid, El Bandido Simpatico, I knew there was a much broader history that needed to be told. And the way for me to do that was to center the new book around these four hombres' lives, knowing also that it would provide me with an avenue to write about history from the 1850s all the way to the 1930s. Because the youngest of the four, Eugenio Salazar, he died in 1935, despite what his headstone said. So I was able to do that, and I was also able to go into a lot of very unique and interesting, lesser-known figures from New Mexico frontier history. Billy Bonney gets a good show in the book. There's 18 chapters. He doesn't actually show up to chapter 5, and he gets killed in chapter 11. So there's history before and after him. But there's also a number of characters who these guys were, to some degree, either around or associated with, such as Vicente Silva and the Society of Bandits, who were like a mafia family in the New Mexico frontier in the 1890s. Also, the Herrera brothers, who were grossly forgotten figures of frontier history. Of course, they were the leaders of the whole White Cap uprising, Los Cuadros Blancas, in New Mexico, and the People's Movement in the 1890s in San Miguel County. And there's just a host of fascinating figures, and even some lesser-known banditos, outlaws that nobody, I think, has heard of, like Porfirio Trujillo, who did 4 stints in the Santa Fe Penitentiary. So it was a big undertaking to write about so much history, but I knew the story needed to be told, and I wanted to tell it as much as possible from the Hispanos side of things, and I think I managed to do that.
I think you did too. So one of the, speaking of that, James, why don't you, at the beginning of the book, the first few chapters, you paint a pretty vivid and telling portrait of Hispano society and what the lives of these people were like before things changed. So maybe you could kind of tell us a little bit about these people and what their lives were like and where they were before this, before, as the story starts.
Well, the story starts in the 1850s when the oldest of the four hombres, Jose Chavez, but I think he would definitely be the most well-known of the four because he was, of course, played by Lou Diamond Phillips in the Young Guns films.
Right.
So I think some people out there would know who he was. He was born in 1850, and it kind of just goes through the New Mexico that those four hombres grew up in. Even though they grew up in very different areas, of course, they ended up linked in Lincoln County in their later years. And it goes through a lot of what was going on with a lot of Anglos coming into the territory, a lot of the culture clash between Hispano culture and Anglo-American culture, and the transition that was from, into the territorial years when, it must be said that the U.S. government, they annexed the territory of New Mexico and took over and started calling the shots, and that created a lot of animosity. And that time it was extremely violent, very different to what we live in now. I mean, when these hombres were born, slavery was still legal, so that tells you how different times were to ours. But the animosity between the Hispanos and Anglo-Americans in New Mexico and in the Southwest, I mean, that even to this day, to some degree, continues. I have a couple of friends of mine, Anglo-American historians. They recently went to Anton Chico and Puerto de Luna in modern-day New Mexico this year, and they told me gringos still are not well received by a lot of the locals in those parts, especially Texans. So that has continued, and of course, a lot of the land corruption that began because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, unfortunately, failed to protect a lot of Hispanos' land rights that they had under the Mexican government, and that led to a lot of problems, a lot of corruption, and it led to the White Cap uprising in the 1890s.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could introduce us. The subhead of your book lists the 4 characters who are kind of your main characters, and I wonder if you could introduce us to each of them. 30 seconds on each of them so we can kind of get a sense of who the people are that you're following through from the 1850s through each of their deaths eventually into the 1930s.
Well, Jose Chavez was one rough hombre. He became a member of the Regulators alongside Billy Bonney, fought in the Lincoln County War. He later went on to he was also a lawman. He became a lawman in Las Vegas, New Mexico. After that, he also turned to organised crime, he was a stone cold murderer, it has to be said, and ended up copping a heavy punishment for his pretty appalling criminal deeds. He died an old man, however, in 1923 in Milagro. So lived a fascinating life. And, of course, Lou Diamond Phillips made his name famous in the Young Gun films, even though, and this is not a knock on Lou Diamond Phillips, that portrayal of Jose could not really be any different from the real Jose Chavez at all.
Oh, keep going.
The other four hombres, Juan Patron was an intellectual prodigy. He came from nothing, became one of the most esteemed figures in frontier New Mexico politically as a businessman, had so many admirable qualities. His downfall was that he was a horribly aggressive drunk. His drinking was not excessive by any means, but unfortunately when he did get drunk, he tended to turn into a prick. And that's what eventually led to him. That's what led to his tragic death, as you'll read about in the new book in 1884. Martin Chavez is without question the single most unjustly forgotten participant of the whole Lincoln County War. Not only he was an orphan, he lost both his parents at a very early age. Not only was he the leader of the regulators, the McSween faction, during the big 5-day siege in Lincoln, he went on to become one of the most esteemed businessmen in the entire state of New Mexico. A former governor was a pallbearer at Martin Chavez's funeral. That tells you how esteemed he was. Everyone across the state of New Mexico in the 1920s knew exactly who Martin Chavez was. He was a revered figure. There he is in a photo with, at the time, Governor George Curry. This is Martin Chavez. And he lived an incredible life of public service, so many incredible accomplishments, and yet he was totally forgotten, pretty much. When I started researching his life, I had to piece it all together from scratch because there had not been one single article, not even an article, ever published about Martin Chavez. There is now. I wrote it. It was published in a recent issue of True West magazine. But he was an incredible, and I think anyone who reads the book will shake their heads thinking, how on earth did this man become so forgotten? Eugenio Salazar was a plucky vaquero. He was a cowboy for John Chisholm. He ended up riding with the regulators, became very good friends with Billy Bonney, as did Martin Chavez. Eugenio rode in the Lincoln County War. He almost got killed during the 5-day siege of the Lincoln County War. He took 3 bullets in a night and almost died. He went on to later become a lawman. He was the deputy under John W. Poe, who you may have heard of. And he lived a pretty long life. He was the last of the hombres. He was the youngest of the 4 hombres and the last of them to die. He eventually passed away in 1935. Now, his headstone says he died in 1936. That's actually incorrect. I found numerous records that show he died in January 1935. But Eugenio he gave a lot of interviews to a lot of historians. According to people like Walter Noble Burns, who wrote books about the kid, he was very dramatic. He used to do a lot of handwork and very excited when he was telling of his experiences, and that impressed a lot of people. There's more to Eugenio's life, but I'll leave that to the people who read the book.
Yeah. So, James, just kind of I'm on the road, and so I'm trying to squeeze in little bits of research as I'm going along. So to get ready for the show, I do as many people do these days, and I went on Wikipedia and I just typed in Lincoln County War, and I read their little blurb there, and there's nary a Hispanic person in the description. So I think I know why that probably is, or I have some ideas, but maybe you could just give us a little bit of a rough outline of what the Lincoln County War is for people who aren't as familiar with it.
Well, first of all, don't trust Wikipedia.
Oh no, yeah, no.
I'm just saying they have. I think they have on the page for Jose Chavez. I think they have his full name is Jose Kobe Frey Chavez.
Okay.
I don't know what amateur hour fuckwit came up with that, but they're completely off. I found his baptismal record. His name was Jose Teodoro Chavez. That was his birth name. But in regard to the Hispanos, Jose Chavez was probably the first Hispano to join up with the regulators after the war broke out. He likely did so simply because he was friendly with the guys on the kids' side. The Hispanos, there were other participants. Siquio Sanchez, who was a short little guy. He was described as, a little bugger, so to speak, out of San Patricio. There were other Hispano participants, but what really kicked off the Hispano participation was on July 3rd, 1878. The other faction, Jimmy Dolan and the House, they ransacked San Patricio because they had been giving the regulators shelter. And a lot of people no one was killed, but the houses were turned up signs, smashed. A lot of people were verbally abused, women and even children. And when word of that got out, Martin Chavez was disgusted. A lot of other Hispanos were appalled. And ultimately, as it headed into what became the climax of the war, really, the 5-day siege, the regulators, Alexander McSween, Billy Bonney, all of them, they went to Martin Chavez in Picasso and asked him to take over as their leader and come up with a strategy to go into Lincoln and, put an end to the war, so to speak. And Martin accepted, and he rallied about 20 other Hispanos to join the cause, including his uncle-in-law, Vicente Romero, who unfortunately was killed during the siege. I think Martin might have had to answer to his aunt-in-law for that. But so that's really how the Hispanos came into it. But they were, Martin Chavez was a prominent participant. Jose Chavez, he was involved in shootouts. And Juan Patron, even though he didn't participate, he had to think of his political ambitions. He didn't participate in the war. He ended up getting caught up in it at times, almost got assassinated at one point by, members of the House. And, of course, he nearly got killed during that siege. And he got shot 3 times, and he actually ended up playing dead in the McSween yard after the battle was over for about 3 hours while his enemies all celebrated in the street, until eventually he crawled away and managed remarkably to get to a house and survived. So the Hispanos certainly played their role, and I will say that of the McSween faction, the regulators, during that siege, at least, if not probably more of them, were Hispanos. So that tells you their numbers, their contributions in the end. And so they certainly played their part.
Well, you quote a local newspaper from the time, the Mesilla Valley Independent, as saying, "The history of Lincoln County has been one of bloodshed from the day of its organization. A spirit of murder and kindred crimes seems to pervade the very atmosphere." So why is Lincoln County so violent a place? And I'm still, what were they fighting about? Right? They're going after each other, but I'm still not exactly sure. If you said to me, well, what's each side fighting for? Yeah, not really sure. So what's the story there?
Well, why is Chicago so violent? Nothing against Chicago. Some places are just more violent than others. Lincoln County had a long history of violence, and it wasn't just the Lincoln County War. There was always shootouts and killings, but the first real conflict was the Hurrell War, which was actually a race war. And Juan Patron was heavily involved in that. His father was killed by the Hurrell brothers during that conflict. That's covered in chapter 3 of the new book. And so you had that between some Texans who hated Hispanos because they were Hispanos, and Hispanos who hated Texans. That's how that escalated and became such a thing. The Lincoln County War was it was about business between a handful of Anglo men, really, between Jimmy Dolan and the House and the English merchant John Tunstall and Scottish attorney Alexander McSween, as well as John Chisholm. And there was a lot of, Alexander McSween appears to have embezzled some insurance funds that the House were relying on the heirs receiving so that they could pay back some debts. That's really what did it. It was an insurance fund war. That's basically, it's very complicated to describe. I don't want to bore the viewer by going into, too much detail about it, but that's what really kicked it off. And of course, even after Billy Bonney died in 1881, there was still plenty of violence in Lincoln County. Still a lot of people getting shot, and it didn't really start to tame down a bit until the late 1880s. And then, of course, by the turn of the century, the frontier was starting to fade. There was still violence, as there is today, but it was really when the automobile came along, and that's where the Wild West finally started to simmer. But I will say this, as you read later in the book, San Miguel County, which is where the Whitecap Uprising took place and where the Society of Bandits were, and Jose Chavez was in his later years and was involved in a lot of violence. That gives Lincoln County a run for its money. That was just as crazy and violent in the 1890s as Lincoln County was in the 1870s. So a lot of conflict all over frontier New Mexico.
But why do you think that is, James? And so let's use the Lincoln County War. I mean, obviously, a lot of these Hispanos aren't involved in the legal dispute between, different merchants and their lawyers and embezzlement. But what's bringing them into this fight, and what are they hoping to get out of it?
Well, to stick with the three of the hombres who were armed participants, Juan Patron did not actually fire a shot in the Lincoln County War. Jose Chavez, you read about him in the new book, he was always up for a fight. I don't think he needed much justification. He was just friends with Billy Bonney's side, and so he joined up with them. Jose was always looking for a fight. Martin Chavez, he ended up taking over leadership of the regulators because he was disgusted by what the Dolan Party did in San Patricio a few weeks earlier when they ransacked the Placita. Eugenio Salazar, he would have developed sympathies for that side as a cowboy for John Chisholm, who was, of course, McSween and Tunstall's silent partner. But for Eugenio, it was a chance to settle a personal score. There was a rustler on the Dolan faction side called Robert Beckwith. And even before the Lincoln County War, over a year before the Lincoln County War, Beckwith had stolen some cows from the Salazar family homestead, and Eugenio basically swore revenge. He wanted to get this guy, and I think that was pretty much that was his motivation, and it was giving him a chance to get some personal revenge against the guy who'd wronged him. And I think there was a lot of that with the Lincoln County War. Guys ended up taking sides because an enemy of theirs had joined the other side. So plus, each side had their supporters throughout the countryside, although some did remain neutral, as difficult as it was.
It does seem terribly violent for such a small place in terms of population. I think I looked it up, that there was something like 2,000 people who lived in Lincoln County at the time of the Lincoln County War. But you talk about some of these other things, and you've referenced them a couple of times: the Harel War, the John Selman Scouts, the Society of Bandits of New Mexico. Could you tell us a little bit about some of these other, organizations? I think for a lot of people, they just see the Lincoln County War and that's all they know. But you've introduced us to a whole variety of criminals, killers, and mayhem that we weren't aware of. So can you go through a little bit of that?
Well, the Lincoln County War, it's often sometimes been viewed and written of as in a vacuum, as if it was an isolated incident. In frontier New Mexico, the Lincoln County War was just one in a series of uprisings against the corrupt power structure, specifically in Santa Fe, the Santa Fe ring conglomerate of attorneys who were pretty much running the whole territory to their own satisfaction and their own increasing wealth. And a lot of people got hurt and exploited by that. But you had the Harel War, which was a race war between a faction of Texans and Hispanos. Hispanos and Texans did not get along at all. A lot of modern-day Mexican Americans in New Mexico still don't like Tianos, and vice versa. But you also had a conflict called the Colfax County War, which occurred in New Mexico, which was against the ring. My book doesn't really cover that so much, but that happened. Then you had the Lincoln County War, which was an uprising against the ring. And then you had the Whitecap Uprising, and it was an uprising against the ring in the 1890s. So it was a series of events. The Lincoln County War is simply the most famous one because it birthed a superstar who we call Billy the Kid. And that's obviously going to get a lot of people more drawn to that. But a lot of the other history is every bit as fascinating. Selman's Scouts, as they called themselves, they were just a bunch of pieces of shit, really. They were a scumbag group of rustlers who went around gang raping women and shooting children and just horrible. I've said that there are different kinds of criminals. Butch Cassidy and Jesse James, they were both bank robbers, but in terms of their character, they were not alike. Butch Cassidy managed to get through decades of outlawry without ever hurting anyone. Jesse James could barely get through 2 robberies without shooting some poor bastard who was just doing his job. Selman Scouts were just plain scumbags. They were filth. The Society of Bandits, as I said, they were like a mafia family in San Miguel County in the 1890s. They were very, very rough and did some horrible things. Their leader, Vicente Silva, well, he ended up murdering his own wife. That tells you the kind of guy he was. And Jose Chavez also participated in helping him murder a couple of other people, including a young teenage boy, as you'll read in the new book. And it was just organised crime in the 1890s, kind of like a little bit like as you see in Deadwood with our Swearingen, but even worse. That leaves Deadwood for dust. And I've actually told my friend John Fusco, who wrote the Young Guns films, I've told him, you need to read about the Society of Bandits, and because that's your next screenplay if you got the time. Make a great series.
Yeah. So maybe, I'm reading about all these things, and some of the crimes are pretty horrific, weddings getting shot up and people getting killed on every page. Why isn't there more intervention on behalf of federal authorities or anybody, really? I mean, it just seems like this thing just sort of plays itself out, and everybody's sort of watching and they're reading about it. They're aware of it, but there doesn't seem to be any intervention or attempt to stop it. Why is that?
Well, there were attempts to a degree. A lot of it was, I think, vested interest. But you have to remember this was the American frontier and the Southwest, and not just New Mexico, Arizona as well. The Apaches were still on the warpath. This was a very, very rough place. And the law enforcement system back then was just very different. John Selman, who led that scumbag gang who gang raped women and shot children for sport, he became a lawman in El Paso later on. He ended up actually killing John Wesley Hardin, the gunman, shot him in the back of the head before he got killed himself. So John Solomon was a lawman. He became the leader of a gang of rapists, murderers, and then became a lawman again. This was frontier, the American frontier, totally different legal system. And it was just, you could say it was just that way of life almost. I mean, horse thievery was so common, it was frowned upon, and a lot of the newspapers, especially the editors back east, they would write about it with such disgust. But living in the American Southwest, to be honest, living in New Mexico during that period, someone getting shot was really not that big a deal. I mean, for those people of those times, one resident of Lincoln County, Amelia Bolton, who was living in Lincoln during the Lincoln County War, she actually witnessed Sheriff Brady, the corrupt sheriff, getting shot down by the kid and the regulators. She was in the street when it happened. She later said, she gave a great quote. She said, and this was in the 1950s, she lived to be a very old woman. She said, "It is impossible to explain to people today how primitive life was in Lincoln County and in New Mexico in those days." This was a girl who would get up of a morning, go to get some breakfast, and there'd be an Apache staring through her window. It was a very different time.
Yeah, I just, there's just, some of the crimes, though, are, like I said, are pretty over the top, and like so the Hurrells, I was curious as to how they can like do all the things that they did in Texas, which weren't very pleasant, then come to New Mexico, do the same thing, but be able to buy a ranch and like be semi-legal, but then still, it's very bizarre.
It's the American frontier. There were incidents such as the Benito massacre, which was a mass shooting. There's no other way to describe that. That was a mass shooting in Benito in Lincoln County in 1884. 8 people got killed by one gunman. That was crazy. But you're right. A lot of it is just stunning and appalling, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just desensitized to it because I spent years researching it and writing about it. Maybe I'm just like, if I get shot, I'll write about that. I don't know. It's just crazy, crazy time. But I think anyone who reads about it, they're certainly not going to be bored.
Oh, absolutely not. No. It's just, I can picture some of these people in New York or Boston reading about New Mexico, and I'm wondering why any of them aren't going, what is going on out there? And
Well, and one of the things that's interesting is that there's a whole bunch of people killed in your book, and I don't think one of them is killed in the classic Western quick draw gunfight mode. People are shot in the back, they're shot from ambush, they're lynched. I mean, they're killed in all sorts of ways. But where does Hollywood get this idea that the most common way for people was to meet on Main Street at high noon? I mean, what is that all about? That is very different than the reality you paint.
In the real American West, you expected no quarter from your enemies, so you didn't give any in return. And you were not going to give your enemy a chance to draw first. If you could kill your enemy with minimal risk to yourself, that's what you did. That was just how it was. The whole high noon stuff really came from a gunfight that Wild Bill Hickok actually had with Dave Tutt. Now, that was actually as close as you'll get to the Hollywood high noon standoff in the street. Of course, Hickok won. He shot Dave Tutt through the heart. But that's pretty much that's probably maybe the only one, I think, where you could look to that, where it would be like a high noon situation. That's just Hollywood making shit up. It must be said. It was kind of, it's just not really wasn't the way it was. Ambush, that was a way to do it. Just start unloading on your enemy if you spotted him in the street. Now, some New Mexicans in New Mexico, they did have old-fashioned duels where they would stand back-to-back and do the 20 paces and turn around. There was one old-fashioned duel in Lincoln County I write about in the new book where, one of them was doing the paces, the other one turned around early and fought. So, again, as I wrote in the book, it was unwise to take any man whose life was at stake at his word in those times. But, Hollywood's Hollywood. And they took that. And also the term gunslinger, that's a strictly Hollywood term. Nobody used that term in the real American West. Nobody really in the American West used the term gunfighter. It was either gunmen or man killers. Those are the terms that were used. So Hollywood does invent a lot of shit.
So, James, how much, obviously we were talking about it's a very violent place and it's a very unsettled place. How much of that violence do you think is a result of the Mexican-American War and, what happened as a result of the Treaty of, what I'm going to mispronounce it, something Hidalgo.
Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Yes, thank you. How much of it is a result of that, or was New Mexico, even if the gringos hadn't shown up, just a violent place?
Well, it still would have been violent, even if the Americanos hadn't, taken over.
Right.
It still would have been violent. How much was directly responsible for that? I mean, that depends on how far back you kind of want to go. I'd say some of it was. There was a lot of racial conflict. There was a lot who was a sheriff at one point of Lincoln County. He once shot an Hispano and killed him for calling him a gringo. That was it. He called him a gringo and he shot him right in the chest and killed him for that. So, there was a lot of racially motivated conflict. Of course, the Harel War, but that also stemmed from a lot of the history with the Texas Revolution between Texans and Mexicans, and that resulted in a lot of lingering racial hatred back and forth. And so it definitely, the treaty, the Mexican-American War, it definitely, I think, played a part. But even if that hadn't happened, New Mexico probably still would have been violent, same as a lot of the American frontier. I mean, you had violence in Montana, Wyoming. It wasn't just an exclusively a New Mexico thing. I mean, look at Texas at the time. A lot of gunfighters came out of Texas.
I would like you to talk more about one of your characters, Juan Patron, because he is the one, I was starting to read the book, and he was the one who immediately stood out to me as different because he's not a man killer. I mean, although he does, I think, kill at least one person in the book. He's educated. He goes into politics. At one point, he's the Speaker of the House in territorial New Mexico. Yet he doesn't ride with Billy the Kid. He's not an outlaw. Why does he always seem like he's on the edge of violence? And and maybe in telling us about him, you can share a little bit more information about him generally.
Well, he lived around violence. Juan Patron was not, I don't think, by nature a violent man. I will say he did lynch a couple of members of Thelma Scout, when they caught him. They did not receive trial. They left them hanging from a tree. I think most people, Juan Patron understandably felt that they were justified in doing that they'd earned it. But so he wasn't, some saint. He was capable. Juan Patron, he was very much on the side of the McSween partisans during the Lincoln County War. So you had the Dolan faction tried to, they were hiring gunmen to try and kill Juan Patron at one point. He was considered kind of a threat to the power structure in Lincoln County at the time because he was very educated and he was on the other side. But what led to him really being personally involved in violence, what led to him getting shot in the back at one point by John H. Riley, what led to him trying to kill another guy and ending up in court for it, and what eventually led to his own death, tragically, in 1884, because he was a pretty young man, was the drink. Juan Patron was a prodigy intellectual, but when he drank too much, he turned into a violent, hostile. I think we've all known someone in our lives who they're a great guy, smart person, but if they get drunk, look out. That was Juan Patron, and unfortunately, that's what proved to be his undoing. And in Port of the Luna in 1884, there was a Texas cowboy by the name of Michael Maney, very affable cowboy who had a good reputation. Him and Juan Patron just got to drinking very friendly one night, and Juan Patron kept asking Maney to buy him a drink, and Maney liked Juan Patron, so he agreed to do so. Unfortunately, as the night wore on, Juan Patron became drunk, and he got the idea in his head that Michael Maney wanted to kill him. And that led to a confrontation in the saloon, and Juan Patron went for his gun first. Michael Maney drew and fired his weapon in self-defense and killed Juan Patron, unfortunately. But and I will say that from after that, Michael Maney, he lived until the 1940s. He never was involved in anything else like that ever again. He never caused anyone any trouble. So he was a remarkable figure, and it's a real tragedy. And as I write towards when I'm covering the end of his death, if only he laid off the whiskey that night, because he had the potential to do a lot more in politics, and but tragedy struck.
So, James, another kind of interest group that is in the book that I think we need to address is all the Native Americans. And so, what is as as all these gunfights are happening and cattle rustlings are going on, are the Native Americans involved in all of this, or where do they fit into the story?
Not so much. I mean, you had there were still resistant Navajo and very resistant Apache in the 1850s and 60s. The Navajo pretty much, they suffered horrendously at Bosque Redondo, which was supposed to be a reservation, but was actually more of a concentration camp. They lost thousands of their people there. It was an atrocity. Their bodies were often simply thrown into the river and left to float down the Rio Grande. Not the Rio Grande. It's 2:00 in the morning. Give me a break. But yeah. So there was a tragedy there. Probably the principal Native American related thing that occurred that I cover in the book, because it did happen in Billy Bonney's time when he was still alive and he wasn't involved, but was the Victorio uprising, Victorio and Nana, and Victorio's campaign where he decided him and Nana, they were going to fight it out with the white eye to the bitter end. And of course, Victorio met his end in late 1880. And so there was a lot of, the Native Americans were involved. I remember Inio Salazar, when his family arrived into Lincoln when he was just a toddler, when he was 4 or 5 years old. He's a young boy. He later said, I expected to find the countryside riddled with hostile Indians. He said, but I found the white man far more violent than Indians. But you still had Apaches around, but they were not the force that they once were. Years of subjugation and just, back and forth violence that kind of lessened their prominence, so to speak.
Your book is called In the Days of Billy the Kid, and Billy the Kid is a character in the book, and of course you'd written a previous book about him. But why is he so popular with the Hispanos. It almost seems like he's a different person with them certainly different than the Billy the Kid who is remembered through the Anglo newspapers as a terrible killer, et cetera, et cetera. But he seems very, very popular with the Hispanos in New Mexico. So what's going on there?
The Hispanos of southeast New Mexico, they absolutely adored Billy Bonney. To them, he was a hero. He was a Robin Hood outlaw. They loved him, and he loved them. One of his amigos, Paco Anaya, later said that Billy liked to be better with Hispanics more than Americans, which he did. He preferred their company. He used to dress like them. I think a part of what helped him was that he spoke their language fluently. He had picked that up earlier when he was over in Silver City in his younger years. By the time he arrived in Lincoln County in 1877, he spoke fluent Spanish, so he was able to converse with as many Hispanos. He was always very kind to the Hispanos, very generous to them. A lot of Hispanos remember that he would give money or stuff like that. I mean, I don't think he went around with a sack handing out dollars, but he was very good to the Hispanos, and they were very, very good to him. They loved him. They used to hide him when he was being pursued. The reason that came about was Billy Bonney was fighting against the power structure in New Mexico that a lot of the Hispano farmers and sheep herders, they despised, very much despised. And to put it this way, less than 10 years after the kid fought against the Santa Fe Ring in the Lincoln County War, well, less than 10 years after Billy's death, thousands of Hispanos in San Miguel County rose up against the exact same people whom Billy Bonney had been fighting against. So if that kind of doesn't answer your question, as far as a lot of the Hispanos were concerned, Billy's enemies were their enemies. And a lot of predatory capitalism, Billy became kind of a symbol against that, even though I don't think that was intentional. But he was they just loved him. And here's something that hardly anybody knows. When after Pat Garrett eventually caught Billy Bonney in December 1880, and Bonney went to Santa Fe and then La Matia, and he was sentenced to hang for shooting Brady with the regulators 3 years earlier, and he was transported to Lincoln, the courthouse, where he made his famous jailbreak, where he killed his 2 guards and rode on out. We talked about that in the last episode we did. But something that a lot of people don't know is while Billy Bonney was being held in that Lincoln courthouse in preparation to be hanged, there was a group of Hispanos, in a few placitas further over, in Picacho and San Patricio. They were planning to bust the kid out. They were raising a posse. Sequio Sanchez was the leader of it. He was actually a regulator who fought alongside the kid. He'd known Billy for years. They were raising a posse of, they had at least 14 armed Hispano men. They were going to get more. They were going to ride into Lincoln and bust Billy Bonney out. The Hispanos were not going to stand back and just let their boy hang. Of course, it wasn't necessary in the end because Billy broke out of jail himself. He shot Bell and Ollinger with their own 2 guns and rode out. And then he was killed 3 months later. But so it was, Billy was one of there were others, but Billy was one of the few Anglos who really crossed the cultural divide. And he was basically, as one contemporary said, he was pretty much just became one of them. He was unos los nuestros, one of ours to the Hispanos. And they still, a lot of Hispanos today, they still love Billy. And probably heard stories from their grandparents or that have been passed down. The Hispanos, they still, to them, he's El Belito. He was a Robin Hood. He was a hero, not the bloodthirsty monster that the Anglo press, who did exaggerate the kid's activities. Bonney was no saint, but they did make him 10 times worse than what he actually ever was. So that dichotomy, it's a fascinating thing. And I think in the new book, you read the new book, you'll understand why. It'll all come clear, and there's nothing more I can say about it that's not written in it because it all makes sense when you look at the broader picture of that history.
Well,
Can
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
No.
Let me jump in with a follow-up.
Yeah.
Just because the other thing, and we may have talked about this last time, but the other thing that kind of blew my mind about Billy the Kid, because you think of him, I don't know, I always think of him as I think of him as an outlaw, but there he is. He's negotiating with Lew Wallace, who's the governor of New Mexico, much against his will. Lew Wallace, who'd been a general under Ulysses S. Grant at the Battle of Shiloh, and and Billy's trying to make a deal for his, freedom in return for testifying, which Lew Wallace says, sure, we'll do that. And then he basically walks away and ignores the deal. So on the one hand, you have his great relationship with the Hispanos. On the other hand, not such a great relationship with Lew Wallace. He's not treated very well by him.
No, Billy was trying to get a pardon. He wanted to clear his name and start over after the Lincoln County War. Billy Bonney was actually the one who officially put an end to the Lincoln County War. I know that might sound crazy to people out there who think of him, as they've seen in a lot of the movies or the exaggerated books. It was Billy Bonney who organised the peace meeting with Dolan and their faction's members in February 1879. And they came to a peace agreement. Billy Bonney was the one who arranged all that. Lew Wallace didn't want to go to Lincoln County and sort things out, so basically Billy Bonney was the one who did it. He was the peacemaker. And then what happened was that night, unfortunately, Dolan and his group got drunk, and a lawyer, Susan McSween's lawyer, got murdered in the street. It was, and because Bonney witnessed it against his will, well, he offered to testify against Dolan and the guys who had killed his employer, John Tunstall, in exchange for a clean slate. He wanted a pardon. He wanted to start over. Billy went into voluntary, custody. He spent 4 months sitting in Lincoln. He testified just like he promised he would, and Wallace just left Lincoln County and never bothered. And Bonney was the prosecuting attorney was, of course, District Attorney Reinerson, who was a member of the Santa Fe Ring, who hated the kid. And Bonney was going to go on trial, and Wallace just simply didn't deliver. He just didn't deliver the promised pardon. And Bonney, for a while, kind of drifted after that. He left Lincoln and went back to Fort Sumner, which became his adopted home. And he started gambling, but the problem, he also felt that John Chisholm owed him money for services rendered in the Lincoln County War. So he started stealing Chisholm's cattle, and he fell in, had a couple of old regulators and a couple of other bandit guys, and he started rustling cattle from a lot of the wealthy gringos on the Texas Panhandle and in New Mexico as well. But one thing Billy never did, he never stole from Hispanos. So that's, again, another reason the Hispanos liked him. He didn't steal from them. And and Bonney, again, even before, not that long before Garrett started going after him, he sent a letter to his lawyer asking if he could still potentially get the pardon. Bonney did not want to be the famous outlaw that he became, and he expressed that himself in multiple interviews after Garrett captured him. They asked Billy in the Santa Fe jail, what did he think of his fame? And Bonney just said, I don't see any money in it. And he said everything in that country has been laid to me, which he had been to a degree. He'd been left holding the bag on all the banditry that had been going on. And even the reporter said that the kid seemed genuinely ashamed of the reputation that the newspapers had created a lot about him, and he'd done a little bit himself to create it too, but a lot of it was exaggerated. Bonney was, this idea that Billy wanted to become this famous outlaw, that's simply not true. And Bonney, in another interview with the Las Vegas Gazette, he told the reporter that, the reporter remembered that the kid's mood kind of soured when they started talking about all these fantastical stories that were being written about Bonney. He didn't like that at all. And he even said, he told a newspaper, he said, I'm getting up a terrible reputation. This is Billy the Kid saying these words. I'm getting up a terrible reputation. And so the real history is a lot more complex than, say, the Hollywood versions, so to speak, although there's been some good kid films. But, and I will point out, Billy was very well liked by probably 95% of the people who actually knew him personally. The people who spoke of him as being this horrible villain, they were people who only knew him by reputation. Even Pat Garrett, in his later years, said, and I'm not saying Billy Bonney was a saint, because he wasn't. He was a killer on the frontier like so many others, and he was a thief. But even Pat Garrett said years later, he said, there were many good things about Billy. He said he wasn't what you would call a killer. He didn't go around shooting up a town. He didn't make a gunplay he never meant. He said, I've known far worse men than Billy. And that was Pat Garrett saying that. That's the man who killed him.
Yeah. So, James, I mean, I don't want to say how does the book end, because when I'm reading the book, I'm really interested in sort of the clash of the cultures, right? The Anglo culture and the Hispano culture, and how they're sorting themselves out, and some of the violence that comes out of that. And you focused on 4 characters. and the story doesn't end because obviously it still is going on. But how do things play out for? I mean, we know of course one is killed, but how does it play out for these guys, and how is that transition made from sort of the chaos of the Lincoln County Warriors to, kind of the early 20th century?
Well, Martin Chavez was the one who kind of profited the most, I think, from the end of the frontier times. He started to enter politics in the 1880s. By the 20th century, he was one of the most famous, revered businessmen in the state of New Mexico. Everybody knew who he was. He ended up on the state tax commission, which was the peak of his political career. And he died of pneumonia, an old man. There's a funny little story, actually. I don't want to give too much from the book away, but there is a funny little story related to his death. About a few weeks before he died, he asked his family, this is an old man at the time, to take him to midnight mass at the St. Francis Cathedral, which was his church of choice. And his family refused. This is his wife and his sons and daughters. They refused. They said, Martin, they wouldn't take him because he was too sick and frail. So he waited until nobody in his family was looking, and he snuck out of the house like a teenage runaway and went to the church to attend midnight mass, which was 6 blocks over in the freezing New Mexico winter. Wouldn't have done his pneumonia any good. His family discovered that their patriarch of their family had ran away. They had to go and retrieve him from the church. That was the last time he was ever seen outside of his home, and of course he died a few weeks later. But he died an old man. He had a great innings. Jose Chavez, remarkably, had a pretty good innings. He died a reasonably old man in Milagro in 1923. He did a lot of time in prison for murder, and rightly so. He was originally going to be hanged. You'll have to read about that, how that ended up getting commuted to life in prison, and he eventually received conditional parole, not a pardon. But he died an old man. Eno Salazar, as I said, he lived to see. He actually would have seen the first movies about the kid. So did Martin Chavez. He saw the famous the first real famous kid movie was the one with John Mack Brown playing him by King Vidor. His film that was based loosely on Walter Noble Burns's book, who had interviewed Martin Chavez and Eno Salazar when he was doing research for the book. Yeah, they would have seen the kid on screen, and the portrayals of Billy on screen. They made Martin Chavez very angry. He was very close with Billy, and Martin did not like when Billy was portrayed as a crook. He loved Billy Bonney. They were very tight. This is one of the most respected and esteemed businessmen in New Mexico, remember? And he's defending Billy Bonney. Again, that's the difference with the Hispanos, with the kid, as a lot of the Anglos who thought they knew who Billy was. The Hispanos knew him best. And so Eno, he lived through that. And, of course, as I write in the book, when Eno was getting into his later years, he was old enough. Martin Chavez died in the late 1920s. Eno was old enough when John Dillinger was doing his thing, and Bonnie and Clyde and all that, the Depression era outlaws that started, the new generation, so to speak. And, of course, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was being formed by Hoover, who eventually tried to take over the whole frigging country. And as I did mention at one point, toward the end of Eno's life, there was this little prick over in Germany, this Austrian fella called Adolf Hitler, who was starting to cause some trouble. And, of course, but Eno died in 1935. He lived to see a lot. And but, he wasn't actually – there was one guy – I wrote about him in Bandito Simpatico. I mentioned him in the new book, Vicente Otero. He was one of Billy Bonney's pallbearers. He buried the kid in 1881, and he died in 1958.
That's crazy.
Which means he buried Billy the kid, and he lived to see the emergence of Elvis. That's how old he is. How long?
Crazy. That's crazy.
Wow. James Mills, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, In the Days of Billy the Kid. It's a big book, but it's definitely worthwhile. I enjoyed reading it, and so appreciate you joining us here today on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate
no worries. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me back on, guys. Always like. I got to say, Rick, I just want to say that's a really cool Han Solo you got there.
Oh, see, you're just buttering him
there
up.
you go. See, most
No,
people,
hey, you got Captain Jack too.
yeah.
You got Captain Jack.
If you come,
I'm a Star Wars fanatic. So that's cool. I got a lot of Darth Vader stuff though. But
Well, my daughter decided at a young age that the Christmas present for me would be an action figure, and that was the biggest one. And then I had gone down to visit her, and he's got a gun attached to his hand, so you can't bring him on in a carry-on, and you can't put him in a suitcase because it's going to look like a gun, and it's big. It's almost like this big. And so I had to ship him anyway. It turned out to be a whole saga. But thank you for noticing. Most people don't even recognize that it's Han Solo. They just think it's a stormtrooper.
Well, I'm just thinking now, what would they on a carry-on? What would they think a lightsaber is?
Well, it depends on who you
What
are.
kind of sex toy is this you're bringing onto the plane? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, this is something I don't want to find out about. So anyway, James, thank you so much for joining us.
Take care.
De nada, amigos.
Okay.
De nada, amigos. Buenas noches.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're not in Hitler's house anymore. We're in another one of Hitler's buildings.
Yes.
Where are we now?
We're in Hitler's tea house.
Okay. We are in the Eagle's Nest.
Yes.
Okay. And first of all, we want to mention and we want to thank today's professional photographer, Chris Templin.
Chris Templin, yeah.
Woo-woo! Okay. And talk about next week's show.
Which is?
Next week's show, we are going to have our D-Day special.
Yes, that'll be great.
And so that's going to be, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And that's going to be Joe Balkowski and John McManus and maybe a mystery guest. I don't know. So we'll be talking about D-Day and
think of your D-Day questions?
The day after the anniversary. Yeah, send us your D-Day questions. We would love to, and stuff you think that we should discuss and get into in that show.
Are we going to go long that time too?
Pardon?
We're going longer that show?
We might. We have before, and especially if we get a third guest, I think we should go longer. And we do want to demonstrate that we are wearing our History HappyHour. History. How do you say the name of that show?
It's a visual aid.
Okay. Yes. History HappyHour hats.
All right.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. Follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, and follow us on historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Ooh, action shot.